Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Alejandro Behr. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Alexander Hinton. And I'm glad many are joining us, among them many colleagues and students from our university and from across the country. Alexander Hinton is director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, and he's also the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention at Rutgers University. He's the author of over a dozen books, including the award-winning Why Did They Kill Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide? Most recent books are The Justice Facade, Trials of Transition in Cambodia from 2018, and the book that he's presenting and we will be discussing today, It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US, published by New York University Press in 2021. He has also two forthcoming books, Perpetrators, Examining Humanity's Dark Side, and Anthropological Witness, Lessons from the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, which centers his 2016 experience testifying as an expert witness at this tribunal in Cambodia. Alex Hinton is also a past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and at the center we had the pleasure of hosting him in 2017 at the conference we organized together with Joachim Sabelsberg, Comparative Genocide Studies on the Holocaust, Conflict and Convergence. So we're really glad to have you back at the center, even on this occasion it is virtually, but we're no less honored to have you. So thank you so much, Alex, and I turn the floor over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's great to be here today and to be back, even if it's virtually. But we're all have facility with that now. And along those lines, I shouldn't have said that because I'm going to try and share a PowerPoint. So hopefully that will work out. Okay. All right. So yes, I'm going to be talking about my book, It Can Happen Here. But before I begin, again, it's a pleasure to be back. And I want to thank Professor Behr as well as Joe Eggers for inviting me to speak and talk about my book. I'm just delighted given what, a renowned institution the center here is. Anyways, I'll probably go on. I think I have about 30 minutes, so I'm going to put myself on the clock, and then there'll be some time for questions. So in terms of orientation, I'm going to talk about 4 symbols, a snake, a fire, a boulder, and a 4-digit code. And I'm going to link each of those symbols, those objects, to a person and tell a bit about a person. So let's, why don't we begin with the snake? And this, at the beginning of my book, the introduction is called The Snake. You can see the snake image on the cover. And I'm going to read, and this will be the only part that I read, the first little bit of the book by way of introduction. Part of the reason I'm doing that is to give you a sense for the text, the prose. I intentionally wrote this in a sort of drawing on creative nonfiction techniques at many points. The book is a journey in a sense, follows, starts before the Trump years, it goes through the Trump years until, mid-2020. It uses setting, it tries to show and not just tell, it mixes those as creative nonfiction does, and involves dialogue, voice. So it's written in a little bit of a different way. And if you think about the etymology of the word essay, it's to sift. Along with the readers, you go on a journey to try and explore an issue, to unpack a myth. And so this is the beginning of that journey that I take. So we're going to begin on the campaign trail with Donald Trump. So this is, again, the first page or two of my book. I want to read you something. Presidential candidate Donald Trump stands before a raucous audience at a campaign rally at the Youngstown Airport in Vienna, Ohio. It is March 14th, 2016, the day before the state's Republican primary. Trump had arrived on his personal jet featuring gold-plated seatbelts and Rolls-Royce engines. It is painted red, white, and blue and emblazoned with Trump's name, which is also printed in thick, bold letters on each of the ramp stairs he descended before walking to a nearby podium, while the crowd cheered and recorded his entrance on their phones. Some hold "Make America Great Again" signs. Trump invokes the slogan several times during his Vienna stump speech, homing in on the country's allegedly dismal state of affairs: job losses, bad deals, manufacturing decline, and decrepit infrastructure. We're becoming third world, Trump laments. The solution is to vote him into office. We're going to do things the country isn't used to doing, Trump explains. It's called "we're going to win." To underscore the point, Trump offers a story. I want to read you this because I love it, Trump tells the crowd. The story, he continues, is based on a 1968 song by Al Wilson, an African-American soul singer. It's called "The Snake," Trump tells the crowd. He underscores his disgust by wrinkling his nose and saying, "Ew, the snake." Reading from a sheet, Trump begins. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor half-frozen snake. His pretty colored skin had been all frosted by the dew. "Oh, well," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you." She wrapped him up all cozy in a curvature of silk, then laid him by the fireside with honey and some milk. Now she hurried home from work that night. As soon as she'd arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. Now she clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried, "but if I hadn't brought you in by now, heavens, you might have died." Now she stroked his pretty skin, and then she kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite. "I saved you," cried that woman, "and you've bit me, heavens, why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die." "Oh, shut up, silly woman," said the reptile with a grin. "You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in." When he finishes, Trump looks up and throws his hands out as if to say, "See?" In response, the crowd cheers, "USA, USA, USA." It's not the first time Trump has related this parable, which is becoming a staple at his campaign rallies. The snake speaks to the heart of his campaign message. The dangerous, malicious outsiders, symbolized by the vicious snake, that they pose to the US, represented by the tender-hearted woman who takes it in. Usually, as is the case in Vienna, Trump precedes the parable by warning his audience about the dangers posed by terrorists, immigrants, and other threatening non-white others. This language of borders, dangerous outsiders, and a nation besieged is familiar to me. My research focuses on genocide and mass violence. Indeed, on the day of Trump's Vienna campaign speech, I was on the other side of the world testifying on precisely these issues at an international tribunal in Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge committed a genocide from 1975 to 1979. If Trump had the snake, the Khmer Rouge had a crocodile, an imagined enemy invader threatening their revolutionary body politic. Such connections between the past and the present are a central plank of this book, which argues that the danger of genocide and atrocity crimes in the US looms much larger than most people realize. So again, why did I begin with this? Why does the book begin with this? Well, in a sense, it's the start of my journey. And I should note that the other book that's coming out later this year, Anthropological Witness, in a sense, it began almost, as a joint project with It Can Happen Here, and then I split them up at a certain point. But that book takes up my testimony, but that's a starting point and at different parts of It Can Happen Here. I also discuss Cambodia. But if we go back to this parable that Trump told on the campaign trail repeatedly, and he actually did it as well when he ran for election and re-election in 2020. But we can see these sets of binary oppositions that I alluded to in the text, that which is external and alien, impure and contaminating, a dangerous threat, perpetrator, non-whites, right, crosses the threshold of the home and bites the woman as a symbol of, later Lady Liberty, Columbia, what have you. And again, it's a violation, a threat, a danger to destroy the internal domestic, the sanctity of the pure home and the victim, and the white victim. And again, down at the bottom, you can see another representation of it in terms of the threat of immigration that Trump talked about incessantly. And I'll return to this parable at the end, towards the end of my talk. I also wanted to, bring up as well, because literally in the same week that I was testifying and Trump was telling the parable of the snake on the campaign trail, the analogy between Trump and Hitler was circulating widely. NPR named it the meme of the week. And people also began to talk about authoritarianism in the US, fascism in the US. So these discourses were all circulating, and I knew I was going to write something about what was happening, though it wasn't until another year or so that I decided to write this book. So if we talk about the it of the book, right, it inflects broadly, the threat of authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism. And of course, these questions were and continue to be raised in a number of different ways. Could it happen here in the US? And again, it inflects towards civil war, but in particular, even as I discuss these different things in the book, I'm focusing in particular on mass atrocities and the extreme of that, genocide, as something that could take place in the US. And I'll come back to that point as well, but I just want to note that, the title of my book is modeled after Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, when he, looking around, saw a number of what we would call warning signs, that were in the 1930s in the US, ranging from neo-Nazis to a demagogue, to the far right Christian nationalist actors. There was also the silver shirts, an analog of the brown shirts. So again, this is one echo of many that the book has with US history. So there we have the first symbol, the snake, and the person linked to it, then candidate and subsequently President Donald Trump. So I want to move on to the fire, and the fire is linked to Charlottesville in 2017, as most of you, I assume all of you remember well, when far-right white power extremists took to the streets saying you, and also it's important to underscore that they also said Jews will not replace us, and I'll return to that point as well later. Whose streets are streets, blood and soil, so on and so forth. But the person I want to link the fire to is Tony Hovader, who was a member of the Traditionalist Workers' Party, a neo-Nazi group. He participated in Charlottesville, and a New York Times reporter, and some of you may remember this story, Richard Fawcett went to interview him for a few days, spent a lot of time with him, and wrote up his story. It did headline "The Voice of Hate Next Door," but ultimately, Hovader couldn't really find an explanation for what had led Hovader to join in. He just seemed like a regular, ordinary person. And so, we have that Hovader, the Nazi sympathizer next door, polite and low key. There's huge controversy. Hovader, or Fawcett, the reporter, later wrote a second story. And in that story, at the end of it, he said, I basically couldn't find the rosebud, alluding to Citizen Kane. And he ended with the line, "What makes a man start fires?" which came from a punk rock, his favorite punk rock album. And so that fire is the second metaphor linked to Hoveder. And again, more broadly and continuing into the present, we have this rising threat of white power extremism, and we saw many different manifestations of it. My book, begins, with the snake, but really gets going with Charlottesville. And then I write in the preface about the Capitol insurrection, which began after my book had already gone to press, but I talked about it, as I said, I got to it a little bit in the preface. So we have, what the quote unquote, what makes a man start fires, but also how do leaders stoke the fires? And so these became the framing questions of my book. What could it happen here? What makes a man start fires? And linked to that, leaders trying to manipulate through discourse and different ways those whose sympathies they can potentially draw upon and garner support. So I'm going to move now to the boulder, right? And it's also a clue to answering the questions, and it poses a third question. And I should note that the boulder, and I'm going to bounce on this point a couple of times in my presentation, is linked to one of the major motifs in the book, which is a lessons motif. Lessons from the past, moral compass. A great deal of the book is actually set in the classroom and includes classroom dialogue as I'm working through with students some of these different issues. And there's a Charlottesville teach-in that I talk about. But I want to go to, in terms of this lessons motif in the boulder, I want to focus today on Adorno, and you can think of that as Adorno's boulder, and in particular as he speaks about it in education after Auschwitz. So we have these questions: could it happen here? What makes a man start fires? And then Adorno, through his famous line, "The premier demand upon all education is Auschwitz not happen again. Can it be prevented?" So how am I linking in the boulder? What does Adorno say in education after Auschwitz? You have to understand the mechanisms, how people become able to commit such deeds. And you have to reveal those to those people and create greater awareness about it. And the problem, and there's a deeper history to this, linked to the Frankfurt School's neo-Marxism and sort of becoming disillusioned with the possibility of revolution, and then trying to labor to get people to become more critically self-aware about the social forces that shape their subjectivity. So the boulder is a symbol of reified consciousness. So what is reified consciousness exactly? Well, if you ask, Adorno tells us in Education After Auschwitz, so he talks about this in many places, but he says it's, being blind to history. One doesn't understand how one came to occupy a given identity, place in the world, and the person whose subjectivity is thereby constituted thinks that certain things are natural, and they don't understand that they're actually contingent. They're historically and socially produced. And so for Adorno, he wants to reveal the ways in which the subjectivity, a person's subjectivity and group subjectivities are formed, and to rupture that and to thereby increase critical self-awareness. So, and sort of condensing what he just said to reify what he just said, I guess, he's talking about denaturalization. And so we have the boulder as thingifying consciousness, but also the need to always historicize. And you can think of that boulder as blocking on the path of historical understanding. So just very briefly, in terms of conceptual roadblocks to undertaking this journey of self-reflection, we have a number of misconceptions that frequently emerge when discussions of far-right extremism, white power extremism are raised. So first of all, we have the myth of American exceptionalism. It's not us. And this will be familiar to most of you, so I won't discuss it in any detail. But there's this widespread ongoing conception that the U.S. occupies a distinct place. It's a shining beacon, quote unquote, notion of manifest destiny. This is a 2017 poll. Actually, those numbers have gone down after the Trump administration, but I'm sure they'll be back up again in a few years. But again, so we had Charlottesville, so on and so forth, and everybody always says, oh, it's not who we are. And there were newspaper headlines again that said, this is not us, this is not the US, both after Charlottesville, but also after the Capitol insurrection. A second conceptual roadblock, the myth of genocide exceptionalism. And this is the notion that, we can't have an Auschwitz in the United States, that's not possible. But to sort of entertain the possibility of atrocity crimes, right? We have to understand what genocide means, what different atrocity crimes mean, and also to look, for example, as Lemkin did, at structural factors and what some have called structural genocide. And it's a little bit of irony. I just wanted to note that soon after the Genocide Convention was promulgated, a group of Black activists, including Paul Robeson, went to the UN and presented a petition saying, hey, the US has committed genocide against this Black population. Lemkin came out and disagreed. That's a longer story. Talk about it afterwards if anyone wants to. But we just had the 70th anniversary. I actually wrote an article in Politico, and then someone responded in Opinio Juris, and I wrote another response. If you're interested, we've gotten into a lot of detail about whether or not we can talk about a Black genocide in the U.S. But that's just one example of the notion that genocide has to look like Auschwitz. It doesn't. Genocide itself takes many different forms. Even if you go back to settler colonialism and look at Lemkin's original definition. So the third knot that I want to talk about is the not me idea. And so this returning to Hoveder, right, the Nazi sympathizer next door. Again, people want to disavow if they have anything to do, or there's anything similar, are there any resonances between us and the quote unquote evil perpetrator. And so we get this, they're uncanny, they're not me, but yet there's this sort of resemblance. And this happened very much with the article that was written about Hoveder. I'm not going to read through the different quotes, but as you can see, there was a huge outcry of people saying, we have nothing to do with him. What you did is to normalize Nazis 101. And so again, we have this notion that it's not me, it has nothing to do with me. And again, this sort of move that is often takes place with discussions of people who are committing atrocities. And actually, we also have seen this with Putin as well, where he's deemed crazy, a madman, as opposed to sort of looking at what he's saying. I don't want to digress into that, but this circulates over and over again. So again, what is reified consciousness? To sort of circle back, Adorno was once asked that, and this isn't in critical models. This isn't in education after Auschwitz. But someone once asked him, are you an introvert or an extrovert? And to him, that crystallized the idea of reified consciousness, because his human complexity was being subsumed under a category, an abstract category. And so ultimately, reification, even if we look at the etymology, we can think of it as thingification. And you can see in the bottom left slide, we have from Maus, this moment when Vladek, a Polish child, looks at him and says, look, a Jew, and he goes from being a human being to being a Jew. Or if you think of what is a university, right, it's a system of social relationships, but it's called a university. So, this is part of how we think, we reify, and this was a big problem. So this is from the journal Logos, and an article about reification had this one where, you have the pizza guy. So instead of understanding what pizza is, you have the reification of an identity position. And so this sort of typologizing, reification takes place all the time in terms of the hater. So after Charlottesville, We saw, this sort of language circulate widely. It also circulated in terms of Hoveder. And so one problem among many is that when we use these discourses, and they certainly speak to something, people are doing really bad things. But for example, if we explain away and dismiss people, oh, Hoveder is just a racist, well, the work of that is to divert us from looking, for example, at structural racism, right? It leads us to look at, hate as an emotion or an inner quality, as opposed to looking at discourses of hatred. It focuses on agency overall, and it diverts us away from examining structure. And there's, again, looking at things like structural racism. And again, from the beginning of the book to George Floyd, where it began to end, structural racism had sort of come to the forefront of discourse in the US in a way that did not exist back at the time of Charlottesville. So if we sort of flip back, well, what do we do about this? Again, it's denaturalize and historicize. Those are Adorno's two solutions. So if we look at history, to go back to the title, many, many examples of the US committing atrocity crimes, including genocide. If we go back again to denaturalizing and historicizing, we can see that white power extremism has a long history in the US that goes back to the very origins of the country, and that systemic white supremacy in some form has existed, continuing into the present, though morphing through time. Right. So when we use, again, the hater language, these sorts of histories are elided, and thinking again about reification and Trump. So if we have the Trump-Hitler analogy, it puts him in a very particular temporal trajectory. And again, that trajectory itself also erases history. Sometimes Trump was linked to Andrew Jackson, it took us back a little ways, but to really understand what's going on, we need deep historical understanding of how contemporary white power extremism came to be constituted, and to use the language of Adorno, how those identity positions, that subjectivity was formed at a particular moment. So again, a lot of the book is, Trump, white power extremism are not exceptional, right? They're symptomatic of something that needs to be unpacked. So I'm not going to go into, the book talks about this in detail. I'm not going to go into it, but, so who, Hoveder, who were the white power extremists who were there? And now we talk more about militias and anti-government groups. They were small, had smaller numbers at Charlottesville, larger numbers at the Capitol insurrection. But we, sometimes talk about the two buckets of far-right extremists. The word alt-right emerged, but some people distinguished at the time, including people on the alt-right, between the far hard right, the alt-right, and the alt-right. And at Charlottesville, the alt-right took off and didn't participate in it, but you had the far hard right and the alt-right. So who was there exactly? Well, we can just look at one of the posters, right? They told us. And again, unpacking, understanding who the groups are, what their different views are. So, range from Southern nationalists to neo-Nazis. But again, to try and understand the event, we have to have this sort of deep historical understanding. So, I talk as well about the long history of white power extremism into the present, but I'm not going to go into any more detail about that here. It's in the book if you're interested. And I just want to sort of make a wave to the Capitol insurrection and the fact that the groups participating had morphed somewhat from Charlottesville. QAnon didn't really exist, or it was very, very few people, were advocating these beliefs back in 2017. It really got going in 2018, 2019, and there were large numbers of people on QAnon. We also had the Christian nationalists emerging in a different sort of way. And we had the militias. You still have other white power groups, but they were not sort of in the majority at the Capitol insurrection, even as I will now talk about, the message itself resonates with these different groups. All right, so we've got the snake, Trump, fire, Hoveder, the boulder, Adorno. And now I want to conclude by discussing the 4-digit code. I think we'll probably go on for another 5, 6, 7 minutes. So the person linked to the 4-digit code is Robert Bowers, who was the Tree of Life synagogue shooter. And sort of the same question that got asked with Hoveter got asked with him, what makes a man start fires? And he offered a clue. If you went to his Gab social media site, he had a radar gun, and that radar gun had the number 1488. So what exactly does 1488 mean? Well, to understand that, we have to move from these earlier understandings of the long history of white power extremism and sort of take up the story at the time of the civil rights movement, and you begin to get a shift. There was already a current of this, but a shift in terms of discourses from those and systemically sort of advocating supremacy and being the dominant order to getting discourses of subjugation and victimization post-civil rights. There are different ways to parse a very complex reality, but I sometimes talk about 3 different phases. If you think about more post-civil rights, white power extremism, the early New World Order groups that formed, a 14 words phase, I'll get to that, and then the last one, sort of with the social media revolution, hashtag white genocide. So in the first phase, I want to zero in for a moment on William Pierce, who some of you may know the Turner Diaries, but it's basically a white genocide fantasy novel, and I don't think it will hurt. You don't need to read it. I can just tell you in 2 sentences what it's about. But this guy Turner joins a white power extremist movement, and that movement topples the U.S., kills all non-whites and quote unquote race traitors, and then proceeds to do the same thing through the entire globe. So, that book came out. Some people call it neo-Nazi scripture, white supremacist Bible, and it had a big influence. And this idea of white genocide that he articulated in that book was taken up by others, and it was given one manifestation and codified by this guy, David Lane, and he sort of condensed it down to a manifesto with a series of points, and his imaginary, and again, this is also true of Pierce and the Turner Diaries, Jews are at the head of this conspiracy, and they're trying to destroy the white race. And so in his manifesto, if you look at the top, he says, he ends it, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. And that's called the 14 words. And so you get the first answer to the 4-digit code. And so the 88 is HH, 8th letter of the alphabet, Heil Hitler. So that's known anyways as it's a symbol that you often see. Sometimes people have it tattooed on their skin, but it circulates widely, both 14 and 1488 together. This idea of white genocide is a key frame. It's not the only one, but it's a key frame in the larger white power social movement, and it plays directly into notions of grievance, and it circulates widely. So, who are the alt-right? Well, the alt-right post-Charlottesville told us. They published their own manifesto, A Fair Hearing, and at the beginning they said, here are the sort of basic principles. First, race is real. Demography is destiny. Second, the Jewish question is valid. And third, white genocide is underway. And then in the introduction to the book, he says, if we really want to distill alt-right ideology, it's the 14 words. So again, the alt-right, returning back to Hoveter, so let's go to the Traditionalist Workers' Party, look at their, what they say on their website. So what's their guiding principle? The 14 words again. I also listened, and I don't recommend this to you. I've done it for you, so you don't need to do it unless you want to take a deep dive. But I listened to a number of podcasts. And again, on one of them, Hobiter was talking with his host, and as they got in, he again talked about the need to have a future for our white children. So this is circulating widely. So I want to draw again to a close here by sort of going back to this issue of, well, how do leaders stoke the fires? Well, let's go back to the snake. It's effectively a white genocide parable. Right? As I mentioned before, the snake is immigrants, non-whites, the white woman, America the Beautiful. The snake bites, kills the woman, and we have effectively a parable of white genocide. It's a sort of return to the initial diagram I showed you. We can just add in the non-white genocidaire and white genocide. I talk about this at length in the book. I talk about other connections to the Trump administration, but to draw to a close, now that we've completed our journey of 4 symbols and 4 people, I want to note that there's a lot more in the book. I have that teapot, kettle on a stove, and the bird, and that was a wave to what comes elsewhere in the book. Could it happen here? Where I take atrocity risk assessment frameworks and apply it to the US in real time in late 2018. Can it be prevented? What are some of the ways? And also I end with Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize speech and her discussion of the bird. So I'm not going to talk about the sort of rising threat. And I guess I don't really have time. I was going to read the last little bit from the book, a moment when I was teaching, but I think I will not do that. But instead just make a quick wave to the Charlottesville teach-in. How do you teach as a professor in the classroom about these issues? So this is how I structured my Charlottesville teach-in, sort of unpacking the very fine people on both sides statement, looking at the category race and looking at its historical, how it emerged historically, unpacking the groups where they're participating, unpacking tropes of the hater. So there's another chapter that focuses in on that. And just to conclude, I'm not going to read any of the parts that are in the classroom, but my goal was again to do the creative nonfiction and to sort of create the sense that of the reader actually being in a classroom for parts of the book. The whole book isn't set in the classroom, maybe half of it is, using setting and other nonfiction, creative nonfiction techniques. So with that, I will stop. I went 4 minutes over. I apologize for that, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hinton, for this illuminating, very condensed, synthetic talk. I'm sure there are questions and comments, and I invite the audience to collect their thoughts and pose your questions on the chat or the Q&A function. While you do that, let me just mention briefly, as you know, this is also an important week in respect to far-right politics in Europe. France is in the headlines. The Reconquest Party, Zemmour's party, and Marine Le Pen National Rally Party garnered 30% of the vote in France in the Sunday election, and Le Pen now qualifies for the second round for the presidential election. And something that might be less known in the US, but that also happened this week on Monday, is that in Spain, which is where I am right now, the far-right Vox party entered a regional government for the first time, forming an alliance with the Popular Party, the traditional conservative party, to jointly govern Castilla y León, which is one of it is the biggest region of Spain. So also a comment, this progressive normalization and also a shift of what is considered acceptable discourse becoming, not just in the US, but also in Europe, Southern Europe, and we know also in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. The distinction between right and far right is blurred. A question that needs to be addressed is this typology that Professor Hinton has shown us, and how this applies to other contexts, far hard right, alt right, alt light, as you showed in your slide, and then the different connecting threads with D, threads with T, right, between Europe and the US. Of course, this appeal to anti-immigrant sentiments, the rejection of multiculturalism, and the great replacement conspiracy theory, right? For white population being replaced by a non-white, non-Spanish, non-French, and a non-Polish or non-German population in Europe. And I would also pose that this identity question is central to far-right politics across the board. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Hinton again, and maybe start with the first question that we have on the chat. I'm not sure everyone can see the question, so I will repeat it. Joachim Sabelsberg, a colleague in the sociology department, asks whether the rise of the radical right is a general Western phenomenon, and what is specific to the US, what is global, Western, culturally, structurally.
Yeah, well, thank you. And also, thanks for making those global connections, which plays into Professor Sabelsberg's question as well. So historically, just to sort of step into both the question and your remarks, there's been a lot of circulation. It goes back into the 80s and even beyond in terms of discourses, including the notion of white genocide. And the Great Replacement theory is linked directly into the idea of white genocide. And for example, the Turner Diaries is widely read in Europe, Australia, South Africa, and other localities, just as different. There's one book in particular that sort of manifests the Great Replacement, and that's also read in the US. So there's all sorts of circulation that goes, even as there are distinct sort of formations that are linked to particular demographic situations in each country, to particular histories in each country. And so in terms of the US, we have this long history of systemic white supremacy. Even as we had that, we had, for example, notions going back to different revolts of the enslaved. This notion that somehow the order was under threat and non-white others, in this case, well, at that time, at the beginning, they weren't Black Americans, they were the enslaved. Later, after citizenship, they became Black Americans, and they were viewed as, a threat, both manifest in this idea that they would topple the order and disempower whites and potentially destroy the white supremacist order. But also you have the notion of Blacks raping white women. And this is a constant worry. And then later on, it sort of recirculates with fears about miscegenation and debates about that. And earlier on in the 1920s, you get notions of race suicide. So you have within the trajectory of US history, this discourse that's circulating, but you have a dominant white supremacist order that's in place and remains in place. It then gets toppled to a degree, right, during the civil rights movement. And at that point, these discourses of what we're now talking about as white genocide come to the forefront, get picked up upon, and they play into more broadly different attempts to change this order. And as a small little wave back to Adorno. So many people in the alt-right talk about cultural Marxism. And very specifically, when people talk about cultural Marxism, they go back to the Frankfurt School, to Adorno. Many of them were Jewish. And this idea of a Jewish-led conspiracy to destroy the white race is directly and overtly linked to this moment. And part of what was going on with Adorno and the Frankfurt School is they undertook, for example, the authoritarian personality study, That's another sort of piece of the puzzle and something I discuss in the book. But part of that was to change the way people, this is the way it's portrayed by the members of the alt-right, for example, to change the way that people think, to restructure their consciousness. And so many far-right white power extremists view this as an attempt of Jews to use tactics to brainwash people and to destroy the white race. Sometimes it's called metapolitics. There's another phrase that exists, and this goes back to some of your comments as well, about why, the far right, far hard right versus the right, and suddenly the lines have become more blurry. Well, very overtly in this battle of metapolitics, right? So people on the alt-right, other white power actors, seek to change the way to do exactly what they think that these quote unquote cultural Marxists were doing. They're attempting to change the ways that we talk and think about these issues. And sometimes it's called shifting the Overton window. And in fact, the Overton window, at least in the US, and I think more broadly, was shifted during the Trump years. And so things that were completely unacceptable to say are now acceptable to say. And we often hear things say, well, how can that person say it? Well, the Overton window has been shifted. And those boundaries of the acceptable versus unacceptable, it's viewed overtly by people in the white power movement, the alt-right, as a battle. And in a sense, even as, they didn't win the battle in terms of having a race war and catalyzing a race war, they did succeed in changing what's acceptable and taking views that used to be regarded as unacceptable, and made it part of mainstream discourse. So again, in terms of the specificity, it links back into these histories that each country has, but at the same time, these notions circulate. And the great replacement theory is just another iteration, another manifestation of the idea of white genocide.
Let me collect a few questions. With many questions in the Q&A and also on the chat. There is one question that came in before you ended your talk, Alex, and it's a question: whether extreme left-wing groups deserve consideration as hate group in this discussion. Let me add another question here from Joe Gertes. Can you go back to the authoritarian, totalitarian fascism point you made briefly early on? And the question is, when is it helpful to hold analytically to such distinctions? There's several others, but let's start with these.
Sorry, what's the analytical distinction one? I didn't catch all that.
When is it helpful to hold analytical distinctions, such as authoritarian, totalitarian fascism?
Sure.
When is it more reification that draws divisions, where actual ideologies, behaviors are not so clearly distinct?
Yeah, okay, so great questions. Maybe I'll start with that one and sort of go back to the boulder and Adorno for a moment. This was the Adorno paradox. Adorno, right, so what we do is the human mind thinks in terms of reification, in terms of abstractions, in terms of abstract categories. To use the word reification is to reify. So Adorno is very aware of this, and he talks about it. It's like this paradox in the way that we think. And the goal for him was always, even as we use terms to subvert, to historicize, to understand those discourses that we're using, to situate them as opposed to posing them as naturalized categories. And so, of course, whenever we make distinctions, and for example, I talked about the two buckets of the far right in the US, and people say, well, it's more complicated than that. Others say, well, sure, it's more complicated, but that gets to a lot of the complexity and provides a way to think about it. And both those perspectives should be talked about. But this is this paradox of the way we think. And actually in my book, Man or Monster, I go into this in some detail using a different set of, I talk about articulation and redaction. And I talk about how this operated in the Khmer Rouge torture chamber as people were forced to rewrite their complicated life histories in terms of a set of categories of betrayal that the Khmer Rouge were asserting. And I note the similarity to the way that law seeks to produce a criminal. There's a psychological assessment that was done of the commandant of S21 prison, who that book is about. And again, they're trying to render and understand them in terms of psychological abstractions and categories. And so in that book, I actually take this up in a different sort of way, but there's this paradox of the way we think, and we continually need to be aware of it. So that's a great question, but again, one that Adorno was well aware of and constantly cautioned us about. The left-wing, extremism, yeah, absolutely. We should all be aware of extremism on all sides, just as, I've written extensively about the Khmer Rouge, which were a far left extremist group. And so in both cases, we need to look at them. What I think the question is looking at is going back to discussions about Antifa. And, this is kind of a bugaboo that gets raised. Absolutely. Let's look at what Antifa is doing. But if we actually, and somewhere, I had many more slides I could have shown, right? I didn't, but at one point in there, I would have shown the different levels, the different attacks that took place, and the amount of violence that's taking place by members of Antifa. And that's, again, a very loose term, as we all know, but it's extremely minimal. So yeah, good. Got to look at extremism in whatever form it takes. But if you're talking about Antifa, that's just, it's a bugaboo. It's not, it holds no water if you analyze and look at the statistics. Now, in terms of the authoritarian personality, I'm not sure, I can remember exactly what the question was, but, we got the F scale. This F scale has been updated by people, and we've got the circulation of the idea, about trumping authoritarianism returning. But of course, for Adorno, and actually in the authoritarian personality, he wrote a chapter that was never published. And in that chapter, he sort of critiqued the entire study and said that we need to avoid overly focusing on those subject positions, those identity positions, because we're focusing on agency and not social forces and not structure. And so that chapter has recently been published. I believe it was in Peter Gordon, I think it was, who did a new version of the authoritarian personality. Again, I'm not sure. You can look it up on the web, but I believe he included this unpublished essay of Adorno's, and we don't know why it wasn't published. Perhaps the reason why is because all the psychologists involved in the study probably wouldn't want it published because it sort of subverted the larger message and their disciplinary assumptions about the importance of focusing on, sort of personality. So it always seems odd that Adorno and the Frankfurt School will be working on a personality study with, psychologists in the US. But if you sort of step back and understand that key point that I talked about before, reified consciousness and the production of subjectivity, then it makes more sense. But once you move into that, right, we're back to the social forces that produce, quote unquote, people who are inclined towards authoritarianism. And so that was, key for him.
Thank you, Alex. Lee Payne asked a question about Republican Party and whether you could speak about the willingness of the US mainstream Republican Party to tolerate extremism. Is it just political instrumentalism, writes Lee, or does it connect with this long history of white supremacy?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, you sort of answered it connects with the long history. And if I had spoken for 45 or 50 minutes, sort of a longer version discussion, I would have gotten into this. If we go back to that distinction between the far hard right, well, first of all, before I go there, just remember the Overton window. The Overton window has been shifted. So what was extremist and unacceptable to talk about no longer is so. So that's one thing that's taken place. And it's also taken place, as you mentioned, in Europe as well. So we have the shift of the Overton window. But more to the point, and linking back to the authoritarian personality in a certain way, if we go back to those distinctions of the far hard right, the alt-right, and the alt-light, the numbers of people that we might place within those categories begin with, let's say 20,000. I don't have it's really hard to quantify. These are sort of statistics that I've seen before. Say we have 20,000 people that identify with, they're members of far hard right groups. The numbers of the alt-right, and especially at the time of Charlottesville, were much larger. Tens of thousands, probably into hundreds of thousands. And I don't want to give you exact figures because I don't have them in front of me. The number of people in alt-right, which is a much more amorphous, broad category, and is less overtly invoking categories of race, right? It will be coded, as is the case with the Proud Boys, and talking about we need to, sort of to support civilization. So sort of white power will be expressed through the notion of civilization, and it's coded in a different sort of way. The numbers of those groups go probably up towards 1 million or more. And then you have more broadly the notion of white power, grievance, right? If we look back at affirmative action, and we see this playing out today as well in different ways. But if you look at all these shifts and you think about all the people to whom a notion of great replacement, white grievance, white genocide, those who that message is going to resonate with, we're moving into the tens of millions. So where do I get that figure from? Well, let's go back to the authoritarian personality. They found that in the US, again, let's just put 10% out there, depending on which of their statistics you use, it can go up or down. 12% of people could be categorized with fascist personality. And I say that with the critiques I already discussed about using the F scale. And then they found that there was a much larger number that had sort of sympathies for this. Well, if we move forward to Charlottesville, there was a study done looking at the number of people who thought that it was just fine to have the white power actors in Charlottesville doing what they're doing. Well, guess what? It came out to about the same number, 9–10%. Other people reworked the authoritarian personality scale. And again, I say this, understanding the critiques, but they've tried to improve it. And again, this number comes out. So we take the population of the US, let's just throw out 10%, 12% there. We're talking about tens of millions of people. So, why is it? Well, that's a lot of voters. You can pick up a lot of votes, right? Because those people are a potential voting block for you to tap into and to shape your discourse so that, you may code it, use racist dog whistles, but you can galvanize voters. It's a potent message. It's not just the far hard right, and that's a big mistake we make. In fact, if you go back to Hoveder, and I'll finish here, in some of the podcasts I listened to, he said, oh, it's great. They think we're a bunch of people who are in the Klan and neo-Nazis. They underestimate us. They don't understand how many people, are attracted to our message. And so it sort of maybe loops us back around again, both to the message of the snake, but also to the hater, that when we think about these groups using the rhetorics of the hater, the bigot, so on and so forth, the supremacist, there are a bunch of different terms that get lumped in here. We're playing directly into the danger of underestimating the power, the numbers of people, the resonance of this message. And I think, compared to the time of Charlottesville, once we have the Capitol insurrection, though the demographics of the people in the Capitol insurrection, if you look at it, also shift and are complex. They don't align directly. But the sort of bottom line is that this message resonates. And it doesn't just resonate in the US, even as it taps into a particular history, but it resonates in many countries that are white identified. And I think that, we got a rocky road ahead of us. We're all focused on Russia and Ukraine, as we should be, but as you mentioned, there are elections going on, and, coming up to the midterms in the US. Anyways, Trump may be sort of in the background in the US, but there are many, treacherous waters ahead.
Maybe we can do one more round of questions, if you're okay, Alex, with this there. And this is also an interesting, these are great questions to close, and these are questions that address, well, what can we do? Where are the solutions? Sion Vivar asks, how can we prevent this? Where do you see solutions? And then also, I think it's a student, Zeli Capolupo, what can students do to help against the fight against white supremacy? And I would like to add a question here also, mentioning an analysis I read recently in the New York Times, an article that Joe Gerges shared with me just a few days ago. It was an analysis of France and the debacle of the progressive forces. And it has to do also with what should we do different in the sense of how maybe we should look inward and see what errors we are committing, let's say, in the liberal progressive camp. Because what this analyst in the New York Times was saying is the following. That in France, the progressive camp has refused to get into any questions of security, immigration, or Islam when there is a trauma of ongoing terrorist attack. And, you know, this is very specific to France, right? Terrorist attacks in the name of Islam taking place over the last few years. And this created a very charged environment. And the argument is that, well, when what is said about this, that these topics come up to be just right-wing topics, the far right then sets the term of the debate. Can any of this be applied to the US? Is maybe to the US cultural wars? Are there wrong politics or myopias or refusal to address certain topics in the progressive camp that play into the hand of the right wing?
Yeah, so great point. And maybe, I'll begin there and say yes. And if we look at for example, the linguist George Lakoff, he wrote a book and he tried to be an advisor to progressives and Democrats in the US. And basically the bottom line is you're horrible, right? He wrote the book Metaphors We Live By. Some of you may be familiar with that and a lot of other stuff. And he wrote a book sort of saying, here's why people on the left, they use really bad metaphors. They have poorly formulated ideas in terms of having ones that resonate with people broadly and fairly simply. And he tried to strategize, but nothing really panned out. So yeah, I think that in the US and in many places, if you harp on a message of white genocide in the way that maybe Democrats used to really harp on the notion of jobs, 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 right? That message resonates. It's easy to understand. If you look at, the left, Democrats in the US and how they're articulating their messaging ahead of the midterms, very few people can really tell you, right? But on the right, you talk about jobs, now it's Republicans talk about jobs, inflation. They picked up that, but they also have these different discourses through culture wars that play upon, this longer term sense of white grievance. It's not a very satisfying answer, but maybe I can give one to the question about prevention. So I have a chapter, in it where I move forward and I talk about prevention. Part of a chapter is set actually at an institution called Chautauqua, which anyways, a long history. It started as a Sunday school, and it has sort of thematic events that run through the summer. It's in upstate New York. And I went to that and they had a week centered on grace. And this was in the same week we had the El Paso shooting took place the day before I arrived. Nguyen Gia, brother number 2 of the Khmer Rouge, died a day later. And then Toni Morrison died the day after that. So you had all these events sort of took place, and I have a chapter that's set there. But I sort of took up the notion of moral compass, which we all talk about. So what exactly does it mean? What is moral imagination? And so in this chapter, what can each of us do? Well, let's not think in terms of reified categories. And so how can we do that? Well, so if you think of a moral compass, if you think about looking around, right, we're holding that moral compass, looking around is trying to understand a context, right? That situationness that Adorno talks about. Looking back is trying to understand the historical path that led us to this point in time. Looking at is seeing someone, even someone who seems to hold views that appear to be diametrically opposed to ours, of trying to understand how they came to think the way that they do, and then to have a conversation and have dialogue with them. And as an aside, the book ends with the bird and Toni Morrison, and dialogue is exactly what she espoused, as opposed to the closing, sort of the closure rhetorics, the reifying rhetorics of, the snake and that Trump was using. So we have looking around, looking back, looking at, looking beneath, which is to try and understand the assumptions, right? When people articulate their ideas, looking beneath, which is to try and understand how we're rooted into the ground with our own set of values, because we have our assumptions that are leading us to think in certain sorts of ways. And all of that prepares us to look ahead, to think about the future, to engage with others, and to move forward. So all of us can do that, daily in our lives. And we've reached a point with this course where, it's very difficult to have conversations because passions are so inflamed. Like me, many people may have relatives who, voted for the other party. In some families, people can't have a discussion at all, but we need to have those discussions with people who hold different understandings. And through those conversations, hopefully as well, to get them to understand how they came to have those views. And if we then circle back to, moral compass and reified consciousness, that's exactly the sort of thing that Adorno advocated, right? We need to de-reify. But if we're sitting there assuming that our values are the best, the right ones, and those people are a bunch of ignorant haters, things aren't going to move forward. So maybe to encapsulate it, moral compass and the continual attempt to de-reify and to have dialogue.
Well, on that note, thank you again for joining us today. Alex, it was a pleasure having you as part of the center's programming, and especially on this very important topic. The talk will be on the center's YouTube channel for those who weren't able to join us this afternoon. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on our next event in the week of April 23rd. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.